Thank you, President Patty. Our Rotary program last week, if you recall, we were informed about the World War II General Jacob Devers. And today we're going to continue with the program about another outstanding individual from York, that being S. Morgan Smith, a minister, an inventor, an industrialist. Our speaker today is the Reverend Dr. Stephen Nicholas, who recently published his book titled Reinventing the Wheel, an incredible story of S. Morgan Smith. The Reverend Dr. Nicholas is a native of York and a distant relative of S. Morgan Smith. He graduated from Central High School, Moravian College, and the Moravian Theological Seminary, and then earned his Doctor of Divinity in Ministry from the Lancaster Theological Seminary. Steve served the Moravian Church for 41 years, retiring in 2007. Steve is a member of the First Moravian Church in the city of York, where Reverend S. Morgan Smith served as a pastor during the Civil War days. Steve will enlighten us on the multi-skilled Smith, a successful minister, and then a washing machine and a turbine maker. S. Morgan Smith's legacy continues in our current businesses in our community. So would you please give a warm Rotary welcome to my friend, the Reverend Dr. Stephen Nicholas.
It is my joy to be here today and share this incredible story with you. This story for us really got started about 4.5 years ago when Jim McClure, the editor of the York Daily Record, came to speak at our church, First Moravian. My friend Terry Downs and I were serving as co-chairs of the 260th Anniversary Committee. Not quite, I mean, I know we're pikers. But we're the third oldest church in the city. And Jim spoke on the Revolutionary War and gave a wonderful lecture about the Moravians and how they were pacifists and had trouble with the community. And afterwards we were talking, and the topic of conversation turned to S. Morgan Smith, who had been our pastor years before. And Jim said to Terry and me, you know, one thing has always disappointed me. He said, I consider S. Morgan Smith the preeminent industrialist in the history of York. Greater than Farquhar, greater than the Smalls. He said, but nobody has ever written anything about him. The most you can find is a 5-page anonymous biography on the internet. And then he looked at me and he said, Steve, he said, you're a retired minister. You've already written one book. He said, why don't you write about Smith? And Terry and I mulled this over for the next 1.5 years. And what you're seeing today is the direct fruit of that conversation. The central question is, how did a farm boy from the backwoods of North Carolina become a wealthy man and leave a legacy which is still found today all over York, including this very building? Because when it was built, his son was the president of the Country Club of York. Smith was born here in Davie County, North Carolina. It's a farm country, and I was trying to think of what it's like. I think probably it's like the Eastern Shore of Maryland, if you've ever been there. Farms and flat. Terry and I were there in 2014, and what we found was that Smith was the eldest son in a family of 6 and grew up on a farm family in this farm county. And on his farm, there was a mill. And as a boy, he enjoyed hanging around the mill. He was fascinated by the gears and the pinions and everything else, and soon became a real expert at fixing things in the mill when they broke. However, he would have probably stayed on the farm because he was the eldest son and just inherited the farm, except something happened. When he was a teenager, he went with his mother to this little church, Macedonia Moravian Church, and there he was baptized, and he felt called to the ministry. So he went to Moravian Theological Seminary and College in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, to study for the ministry. Before he was finished his studies, the Moravian Church Board sent him to the Moravian Church in York, which had been without a pastor for 8 months and needed a pastor, so he went there as a student pastor. However, they liked him in York, and 4 months after he went there, the church board asked if he could be ordained and be their permanent pastor. And so he was ordained in March, and in April, he married the church organist. So now he was really going to remain in York. Smith was from the South, but he did not grow up in a slave-holding family. His parents had no slaves. Indeed, Davie County was not really big slave country because they were all small farms. His father had a farm of 200 acres, and there was only one large plantation in all of Davie County. And Smith was opposed to slavery on theological grounds. As a Christian, he felt that people needed to be free to come to God and to make their own choices. And in York, he really became an abolitionist. This is a sermon. Can you see what it says at the bottom? Can you read it? What does it say? Anybody? The Union and the Constitution. This is written on big letters on a sermon he preached in August of 1862. 2 years later, Smith enlisted in the Army. Didn't actually enlisted he became the chaplain of a Pennsylvania regiment, the 200th Pennsylvania Volunteer Regiment. He was the first Moravian to serve as a chaplain because the Moravians had been pacifists up until this time. And I'm not going to tell you, it's a whole story of how this southern man who was from a domination that was pacifist ended up serving as a chaplain in the Civil War. It's in the book, and you can read it there. He served for 9 months, and when the war was over, he was mustered out, and went back to York and became their pastor again. And then he was called to serve the Moravian Church in Dover, Ohio. And as you can see, Dover was a station on the Ohio Canal. And while he was there, he had a very good ministry for 5 years, but something happened. Actually, 2 things happened that were to shape his life. One is he got bronchitis in the winter of 1870, and he just could not shake it. His doctor said if he would quit preaching and he would move from Dover, because Dover was also a steel town. They had a steel mill and a blast furnace, black soot in the air, and he was breathing this stuff. His doctor said, you've got to leave. And so he left for 3 or 4 months in the following summer, and he got better, but he couldn't shake it. And in those days, you didn't have this. In those days, you had to speak like this. And he didn't just do it for 15 minutes on Sunday morning. He did it. I've read his sermons, 45 minutes to an hour. Sunday morning and evening, Wednesdays and other times during the week at outlying preaching stations. He could speak, but he couldn't preach. So reluctantly, he wrote the church board and said, I'm not going to be able to continue, but I think maybe if I take a year off, I can come back into the ministry. But what is he going to do now? He's going to leave and retire. What is he going to do? How's he going to make a living? He's going to make a living this way. The second thing that happened while he was in Ohio was he invented a washing machine. Eventually, he and his wife had 6 children, and as he watched her struggle, he thought, you know, I think I can find a better way of doing this. Isn't this how many inventions, you know, come into being? And so he invented the mechanical washing machine in October of 1870. As you can see, there's a crank on the right end. That crank, there's a shaft that goes back and forth, and really, you have basically, if I do this to industrial audiences, I bring a schematic drawing. I don't have it. But it just rubs back and forth against 2 corrugated boards, and it actually got the stuff clean. He made lots of money with this, and came back to York, and brought his family back to York, and he got his neighbor, who was a carpenter, to get the parts from a machine shop and make the mechanical washing machine. York Manufacturing Company came about because Smith needed a factory to build his machines. He was selling so many that his neighbor couldn't keep up with the demand, so he got together with Oliver Bollinger. Oliver Bollinger had invented a water turbine. Oliver Bollinger was a millwright. And Oliver Bollinger's cousin, Henry Lamott, owned this building, which was a machine shop. But they didn't have the large tools that they needed to make the water turbines. So Smith and Lamott and Bollinger got together, but they still needed money, capital, so they talked Jacob Laux from the Laux Milling family into being part of the partnership, and they founded York Manufacturing Company in 1874. Smith became the first president. Bollinger left a year later because he made his turbine better and got a new patent and started his own company. Now York Manufacturing had 2 products, one an obsolete water turbine, and the second, Smith's washing machine. So Smith set out to work on the old obsolete water turbine and make it better, and he did, and patented it in his own name in December 1876. Smith left York Manufacturing in 1877, set out on his own, and visited millers. York, Berks, Chester, Lancaster, Adams, all over the place, showing them a model of his new turbine and taking orders. And the first turbine was installed, BENTZE'L's Mill. Have any of you seen BENTZE'L's Mill? It's on Greenbrier Lane near Dover. It's still in pretty good shape. Installed that in 1877. This is Smith's business card from the 1880s. You see he calls himself S.M. Smith. Didn't start calling himself S. Morgan Smith until 1882, and nobody knows why. But actually, Stephen M. Smith, S. Morgan Smith, it's a little more memorable. His business began to grow, and in 1884 he called his eldest son, Charles Elmer Smith, to come home and help with the business. Actually, at this time there were about 60 companies in the United States making water turbines. In 1950, there were only 4 companies making water turbines. The question arises, how is it that the S. Morgan Smith Company flourished when 46 companies went out of business? I'm indebted to the fellow, Lila Strayer, right? Or is it Stayer? The guy from the PA archives. Jonathan Stayer wrote a paper on this, and I added one thing to it, and he says, personal attention. I'd like to think Smith was very courteous, he was personable, he was kind to people. I've seen his correspondence, but I'd also like to think he was a pastor. And he knew how to get along with people. Not only that, but Smith spoke Millerese. Now, in other words, he was very comfortable talking to millers. And many times, and he was not a high-pressure salesman. He would simply meet the millers, talk to them, chat with them, and this was good for his business. Second, promotion and advertising. He bought penny postcards, 700 and 1,000 at a time. What did he do with them? Sent them out to millers. His products were superior. In Canada, there was a water turbine that had a 95-foot head. That's 95 feet of water. The dam was holding back. And it had been, and 5 different turbines were installed, and every one of them broke until Smith installed a turbine, and it worked perfectly. He had a superior product. Foresight and vision. John McCormick invented a better turbine, more efficient turbine in 1888. Smith paid him $10,000 for the rights to manufacture it and to sell it. So he was not wedded to his own turbine, but he looked ahead. His orders grew so much that he needed his own factory, which he built in 1890 with a loan from the Foz family. And you'll see, this is an 1894 picture, and already they've had to enlarge the factory. Fortunately, or maybe it was the providence of God, Smith came along at the right time in our history. He came along just as electricity was coming on the scene. There you have a picture of Thomas Edison and George Westinghouse. You probably know Edison invented the light and patented it in 1880, and he started putting up power stations a couple years later in New York City. But Edison used direct current, DC. DC didn't have much of a range. DC is only good for, a mile or two. George Westinghouse came along, invented a better transformer, which could step current up to travel long distances and step it down at the end. And ultimately, Westinghouse and alternating current prevailed. This is the Folsom Powerhouse. Yes, it's right upstream, about a quarter of a mile from the Folsom Prison. And it's the first powerhouse and dam that Smith did. And he did this with George Westinghouse. Westinghouse provided the generators, and the Smith Company provided the turbines. Smith sent them all out, and 20 cars of a railroad train to California. And about this time, the Smith business begins to pivot from mainly making turbines for mills to making turbines for hydroelectric installations. This is the last installation before Smith himself died. It's Morgan Falls. Smith died in 1903, and he was working on Morgan Falls right outside of Atlanta at the time. He founded the Atlanta Power and Water Company, and the Westinghouse Company was part of that as well. He died in 1903, and they named the dam after him in his memory. This is where he's buried. It's in Prospect Hill Cemetery. He died on Easter Sunday. Isn't that something? Easter Sunday, 1903. The last words out of his mouth were, "Oh, the joy and the light and the glory on the face of God." Amen? I couldn't help that. But isn't that a way to go? His widow, Emma, said that the funeral was the largest York has ever seen. She claimed 10,000 people came. Terry and I doubt that. The church will only hold 500 if you use both the first and second floors. But there may have been thousands who came to the viewing. At any rate, his sons took over the company. C. Elmer was the president, and S. Foz Smith became the vice president. C. Elmer was also a visionary, like his father. C. Elmer is responsible for this building being here. He was the president of the country club when they moved out of the city, and there were other members of the club who wanted to put it in a different place, and he wanted it to be here. You'll see as you come in the front door, it says, Country Club of York, Charles Elmer Smith, President. There's a room across the hall that is known as the Charles Elmer Smith Room. Actually, S. Morgan Smith and his heirs helped to make York what it is today. Charles Elmer was on the hospital board when the new hospital was built. Stephen Foss was the treasurer of the building fund for the YMCA when the YMCA was made. He served as the vice president for 25 years in the Historical Society, and when he died, he left a considerable bequest in his will to the Historical Society. This is a KAPLAN turbine runner. You see the blades on it, they're movable. That was a new thing, and the Smith Company went to Austria in 1927 and got the rights for that. And then they installed 10 of them in the Bonneville Dam on the Columbia River, producing 750,000 horsepower, still in business today, but of course the turbines have been renovated. This is Beauchamp Smith. I'd like to see the hands of those of you who have ever met Beauchamp Smith. Still some left, good. When I was a boy growing up in First Moravian Church, Beauchamp Smith was a real presence. As a matter of fact, he sat in the adjoining pew that my mom and dad and my brother and sister and I sat. He was there almost every single Sunday. Half of our congregation worked at the S. Morgan Smith Company. But this has all been lost because the company was sold in 1959 and the Smith name has largely disappeared. Beauchamp Smith founded the York Community Foundation in 1961. He and his wife gave the first gift, and they hoped that others would follow them, and others have followed them. Look at that. $125 million in assets started with $15,000. $700 in gifts the first year. Are you from the York community? Are you from the community? Yeah, okay. How would I know? Smith turbines, they're all over the world on 5 different continents, including famous ones like the Aswan High Dam in Egypt. These are 4 of the companies that grew out of Smith's work. Upper left, that's the Smith Hydraulic Lab at Voith. Right, American Hydro. Lower left, Precision Components, which is in the old Smith building on Hartley and Lincoln Streets in the city. And on the right, Precision Calibration and Testing. And of course there is York Manufacturing, which grew into York International, which today is Johnson Controls. The lasting legacy of S. Morgan Smith, places where we find him today, where we find the influence of Smith and his family. The Smith family were in their generation what Louis Appel and Charles Wolfe and others like them were today. They were community-minded givers. Burl Smith once told a friend of mine that he believed that money was like grease. You had to spread it around so it would do some good. This is the 18-foot window dedicated to S. Morgan Smith in our church. In our church and our community, you can find his legacy. I would like to acknowledge the help of my friend Terry Downs. Terry, would you stand? Terry helped me with the research and also some of the writing for our book. I could not have done this by myself. The book is available at the York County History Center, and I think Terry has a couple here if you're interested in seeing him. thank you very much for the privilege of sharing this with